Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Leaders in Astrology series. Today, I'm beyond delighted and honored to be joined by highly esteemed astrologer, author, and teacher, Demetra George. So thank you so much for joining us today, and how are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for asking. It's been an exciting year in astrology. I've had the opportunity to travel and go to conferences and other events and see other astrologers in person. And that's been really heartwarming and gratifying and stimulating.
Wonderful. It seems like you never stop traveling and working, which is remarkable.
Right. It's the life of the astrologer.
Wonderful. So, as we do in the series, I'd love to start at the beginning of your astrological journey. So, can you tell us how you first became interested in astrology and what was that early environment like for you?
Well, when I think back in my mind to my earliest awareness that astrology was something that people could study and learn. It brought me back to being a sophomore in college. And I was aware of a small group of juniors and seniors who, I looked up to, but I didn't hardly know. And I had heard that, and we were going to a school, the College of New Paltz, that was about 100 miles of New York City. And I had heard that every week they would drive to the city to take an astrology class with someone, and that teacher would also cook them a wonderful meal. And I thought that was just so exotic and wonderful. And I was sort of in awe. But I was involved in being a college student and carrying on in my life. And it wasn't until after I finished school in my early 20s, and then after traveling, uh, found myself in Southern Oregon on a commune where many of my college friends had moved to. And it was a group of, I don't know, it ranged between 40 and 100 hippies living on a mountaintop in Southern Oregon. And with them, many books showed up in our library. And among those were about a dozen astrology books. There were books on Eastern spirituality and tarot and psychic healing and numerology. And I remember sitting around scrubbing clothes on a washboard with water we heated over an open pit fire and having conversations about the Theosophists and Krishnamurti. So it's a very interesting contrast of that environment. And so after my second year there, I thought to myself, I'll go mad if I have to spend another winter crocheting Afghans. And I started poking around the library and I said, oh, maybe I'll learn how to cast a chart. And indeed, I did in the September of 1971. I picked up Llewellyn George's horoscope maker and delineator. And after a few days, I produced a chart. And there I was, making charts for other people in the community and just starting to figure out what they meant.
And I'm curious, was your first chart of your own, or was it a friend or a family member?
I can't totally remember. I knew that initially I had the wrong chart for myself because I wasn't aware of Illinois' time change rule that births had to be recorded in standard time, even though daylight was in effect. And it took me some time to order my birth certificate and actually see what was going on compared to my baby book announcement from the time I had been using. But then my child was born. My first child was born several months later. And I remember nursing my child in a rocking chair in front of a wood stove and reading Rudyard's Astrology of Personality and Alice Bailey's Esoteric Astrology. So that's the beginnings.
Absolutely wonderful. And talking about your incredible body of work over the decades, which we're going to get into now, I'm not going to quite go in a chronological order, but I'd first like to go to your work with the asteroids. And of course, your brilliant book, which is the Asteroid Goddesses. So my question is, can you first tell us how you first came interested in studying the asteroids, and ultimately what was your inspiration for writing this book?
Okay. So that really is part of the chronology here, because I cast my first chart in September of 1971. By April of 1973, so that's not quite 2 years later, I heard of an astrology conference happening in San Francisco that both Dane Rudyard and Michelle Gauquelin were speaking at. And of course, I really wanted to go, and we did go. Uh, and I remember standing in the lobby, waiting for the doors to be opened and not knowing anyone. And there was a friendly looking person standing, was to the left of me. And I sort of inched my way up to some approximate distance from her so it wouldn't look as if I was standing there all by myself. And that turned out to be Eleanor Bach, who was the person who got the first asteroid ephemeris published after years of trying to convince astronomers to create the ephemerides. They had just come off the press. She had brand new copies in her purse. And when she asked me my name, which was Demetra, my grandmother's name, and she knew it was the correlate of Ceres, the asteroid that prompted her inquiry, she looked it up in her ephemeris and saw that Ceres was opposite my sun, and then gave me her book. And it turns out that was the astrologer who had been cooking meals and teaching my friends in college. So I thought that was so interesting of how the lines of our fate can appear to us years before that fate becomes obvious, so we recognize it, but that web has already extended and is surrounding us. So then I picked up the book. Um, what I was quite naive. I lived on a hippie commune in Southern Oregon. I didn't know that the mainstream of astrologers thought the asteroids were floating gravel and totally irrelevant. And I went back and started putting asteroids in the charts I was doing. I knew the stories of the Greek goddesses because I had heard them from my grandmothers. And so when I would see an asteroid prominent in the chart, I would tell the story. So I don't really know what this means, but let me tell you the story of Ceres or of Pallas Athena. And the people would just be shocked and saying, "You've just told me like the major story of my life." And that's where I began to see the power of myth and archetypes in astrology, all functioning, all being integrated. That when a planetary body is prominent at birth, the mythological story and the attributes of the deity that shares the same name as the planet often becomes an overriding theme in that person's life. And the specifics and the events of how it plays out are different for each person. Just like different theater companies will perform the same play, and the specifics like costume and scenery and emphasis and stage setting all differ, but the essence of the story is so similar. And so that has been the context or the theoretical underpinning that has carried all of the mythic work forward in the last 50 years.
And of course, part of the title is the re-emerging of the feminine. And I
Yeah.
think you talked before, maybe some of the misogyny that's permeated, well, obviously through societies for a long time, but I think even within the astrological community, because even at that time, you're looking at the mythology and you're looking at the planets, there is that inequality. And as we know, the traditional female qualities of the Venus and the moon, but that re-emerging of the feminine by bringing these
Yes.
asteroids back to the community. What was the reception that you got ultimately?
The reception was not particularly hospitable. And, astrologers are saying, oh, they're just pieces of floating gravel. Or, the first four series, Pallas, Juno, and Vesta, those ephemerides came out in 1973. Very lukewarm to non existent reception. Chiron came out in 1977, and astrologers were much quicker to embrace Chiron, of course, because if we're looking at it from, a sexist male female gender thing, like Chiron was guy and these were feminine. And as we moved into the 70s and 80s, there was a huge revival in the larger New Age culture of feminine spirituality. And I had the opportunity to work with that community as well as with the astrological community. And all of the women who were becoming aware of the existence of a goddess and the status that worship of the goddess had at earlier times that had been sort of not taught in our history was so strong. And I thought to myself, this is my audience. Even though they're not astrologers, they're not going to become astrologers. Many of them go to astrologers to get readings. And so I created a format where I could teach the goddesses and run their charts and just say to them, oh, Juno is strong in your chart, or Pallas is strong in your chart, without doing the sign house aspect, but just identifying it, giving the teachings, and the reception was phenomenal. And then what happens is that those people are going to their regular astrologers and they go, hey, what about Pallas on my ascendant? Like, why aren't you talking about that? And then in some ways it was through feeling pressured by their clients that astrologers who had already established, I'm doing fine with the 10 planets I already have. I don't need anything else to clutter up my chart. And, in the 1930s, there were a lot of people that were protesting using Pluto for the very same reason. However, it was through generating the energy from the grassroots that they began to, instead of trickle down, they began to seep up into the larger astrological community.
Wonderful. Even in the last few years, particularly within the community, bringing up references to your books. I think if we look in recent times after the Me Too movement, of course, very recently now I've just cast my vote the other day in North Carolina here. We could actually have the first female president of the United States, which is, I noticed with Kamala, she has Vesta conjunct the midheaven. And it's quite interesting as well, do my research before this interview with Eleanor Bock. I was just curious, Gemini moon curiosity. I pulled up her chart and I noticed she had Pallas Athena on her ascendant. So I thought that was curious, of bringing that wisdom and knowledge to everybody at that time.
Right. And she really needs to be honored as the very first person to bring the asteroids into worldwide astrological community. Now, astronomers had been aware of the asteroids, and even in the 1800s, they had given them glyphs. And that is in some of the astrology magazines or astronomy magazines and publications. However, Eleanor was the first person who created ephemerides so that astrologers could place them in charts. And in 1973, that's what opened up the study of 4 feminine goddesses in astrology, but it was part of a much larger movement starting in the late 60s and going into the 70s and 80s of women's spirituality and the rediscovery of the goddess. And so what was happening with first, seminal books like Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique, and then Gloria Steinem with her magazines, and Merlin Stone, whose book When God Was a Woman, and Rianne Eastmeisler. What as I said, what happened was that awareness opened up in the collective, and now astrologers had astrological bodies that they could put in people's charts to address the many more roles and options that women realized were available for their expression, being in addition to the moon and mother as mother and Venus as wife. And so, but this was astrology's piece of a much larger collective movement. And while I'm on this, let me just add one more piece and taking it back to the discovery of the asteroids in 1800, 1801, that the event that sort of foreshadowed that, preceded that, was Mary Wollstonecraft, who in 1797 published On the Vindication of the Rights of Women. So that pamphlet emerged within a couple of years. The first asteroid was discovered. It was given the name of one of the major Greek goddesses, and in quick succession, three more asteroids were discovered. And Ceres, Juno, and Vesta were the three sisters of Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto. They were the royal princesses of the Olympian family. And Pallas was the favorite child of Zeus or Jupiter, born full grown from the top of his head parthenogenically, so they like to say. So these are like, they have major status in the genealogy and pantheon of Greek mythology, and therefore I've always felt that they needed to be treated as fully equals with Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto, who were the three brothers. And whatever emphasis we give to those, whatever orbs we give to them, whatever, however we use them, the same accord needs to be given to the those four goddesses. Then you have, a slew of, 30,000 other asteroids, many of whom are also mythological and minor deities. And you treat those a little bit different than the first four.
I think one of the most remarkable chart examples I've seen you give, and you obviously you get to the point now where we're upwards of the 30,000 asteroids, however may there be, and possibly not all named, but the chart example in my neck of the woods of now King Charles, of the chart you show, and it just blew my mind. And you've got there with, I believe, if I remember correctly, you've got Charles with his domicile Venus Libra, and I believe either side, both the asteroids of Camilla and Parker. Is that correct?
Yeah. Parks.
Park, sorry.
Camilla and Parks. Right. So what do you know within like half a degree of the conjunction with Venus? So what do you do with something like that? I mean, I have seen thousands and thousands of those examples. I feel like it brings us really to the edge and like floating over the abyss of the mystery that astrology is. And, when I saw that in Charles's chart, whatever attitude I had over how it all came down with Diana, I had to release, because from the moment of his birth, woven into his energetic wiring nature, was a love Venus for someone carrying the name vibration of Camilla and Park. And so it was like, it was there from the beginning. And what can you do with that except like just follow it?
And I believe part of your advice, which I've done for myself, is any significant names, if you go through the asteroid, just pop them in your chart and see where they come up. And it's again, absolutely mind blowing how much information you can glean. And I believe, correct, if I'm correct, you usually keep about 500 loose asteroids to pop into a chart.
Yes, I do. I have a list of about, and that list has changed over the years, depending on what I'm interested in and what I'm doing. And sometimes I'm more in an Egyptian phase or more in a ancient Near Eastern phase, or trips that I take or lead. But I have a list of about 500 asteroids that have, they're sorted zodiacally. So they start at, the list starts at 0 Pisces and goes to 29 Aries. So I can take that list, I take my chart, and I run my finger around the chart and go to the midheaven. Okay, and then, okay, what asteroids are within a couple of degrees of the midheaven? Okay, then I look for the sun. What asteroids around the sun? Let me see if there's something within 1 degree opposite the sun. And so I started with like 7 significant points, the degrees of the 4 angles. conjunctions to the sun and moon and to the ruler of the ascendant, and then sometimes oppositions to the sun and moon. And that will be my first range of most significant asteroids. But then once you're comfortable with that, then you can start looking for the asteroids there with personal planets or complete major aspect patterns, or happen to be receiving outer planet transits or involved in synastry. And so you can further refine that list, but that you start with just identifying the ones that are most important. You keep your orbs really small, and you don't get involved with like 7-degree quincunxes to an outer planet, which
So for you, is it mainly the conjunctions, oppositions, possibly, but
yeah,
not getting into the minor
right.
aspects?
Although the more experience you have with using them and recognizing patterns, for example, you have a mythological story. And in the story of, let's say, the asteroid series, she has a daughter, Persephone, who's abducted by Pluto, the god of the underworld. And Hecate provides the guidance of where Persephone was abducted to. And those stories are related mythologically. And if in a chart you begin to see all the asteroids that are part of a mythic story also show up in key places in the astrological chart, you realize that that story becomes more and more prominent and descriptive of the person's life. Then you might take one of the asteroids in the story and you see, oh, it's like an exact trine to the ascendant that has like some asteroid on it. And you go, okay, in this case, I can consider this because it's part of a larger integrated pattern. So that isn't like a hard and fast rule, but that you can't do that before you are grounded, before you've built your foundation of how to work with them. You can't be putting decorative touches on upper windows.
And touching on your point there about mythology, how important or how useful is it for astrologers to go back and study the mythology and to help them enrich their practice to understand maybe the context of the chart and what's going on? I believe you have your master's in classics, is that correct? And
Yes.
so how important do you think it is for astrologers to at least have a look and read the mythology?
For the approach that I have taken, it is essential. And in fact, mythology that really are the stories and attributes of a culture's deities was the very stands that concept at the very beginnings of the origins of astrology in ancient Mesopotamia. And their cosmological belief was that the divine is immanent in this world, all around us, in all parts of nature. And the stars and planets are one of the manifestations of the divine. And that the planetary bodies shared the same names as their gods and goddesses. And when a planet appeared or took a prominent stand in the sky, it was as if the deity was making an appearance and saying to humanity, hey, like, listen, pay attention, listen up, like there's something I'm trying to tell you here. And to the extent that part of the religious belief was like people are here to serve the gods, it was useful to know what the gods wanted so that you could serve them. And their appearances in the skies were indications of what it was that you needed to do. And then and whether, and here's part of the mystery, whether the Babylonians had documentation for thousands of years that when Venus appeared, it had to do with fertility on the land and crops. And they did record that maybe 800 years after Venus was named Inanna, who was their goddess of love and fertility of the land. And so, did they arbitrarily give a planet the name and ascribe certain characteristics to it in accordance with the attributes of that god or goddess, and then said when it appeared, that's what would happen on Earth? Were they charting what was happening on Earth and worked backward? That we don't have any evidence for, and that's like what part of the mystery is. But certainly, when whoever named the asteroids Camilla and Parks, that astronomer was not collecting, 800 years of data of which people who had those asteroids fell in love with someone who's had that name. And so that what we're faced with is like one of the biggest mysteries of how it is that astrology works. And it's almost as if naming something is a magical act, which activates that quality within the body that then, I don't know how that happens, how it expresses then in human life, whether the body and the center of consciousness internally are one and the same. And by calling something out there, you awaken it in here. I don't really know. I've been thinking about that for more than 50 years. And it is the question of astrology.
It kind of ties me into another question I wanted to ask you. A
Yeah.
few years ago, I have you quoted here saying, "My trajectory has been towards fate rather than free will." And curiously and interestingly, not through the Hellenistic traditional
Yeah.
astrology work, but through the asteroids. Can you expand on that point?
Well, we just did one thing with Charles and Camilla.
Hmm.
Okay. And especially with the personal name asteroids, there's like so many more examples. I worked a lot with the chart of Jackie Kennedy Onassis, and um, opposite her moon, and Valence says the moon is one of the significators of legal marriage for women. Like within a 1 degree orb of the asteroids John and Aristotle, the name of both of her husbands. And then her third relationship, whom she didn't marry, was Maurice Templeman. And within like a degree on either side of her midheaven is the asteroid Maury and Temple. And so, again, from the moment of her birth, the names of these individuals were keyed into her chart in the most significant places possible relative to their expression in her life, because Maurice Templeman, whatever fortune she got from Onassis, he was a diamond financier, and he increased her fortune like exponentially. And she had her own part of fortune up there as part of that midheaven connection. So, where does that bring you? Where does that bring you to? That the important. We're just working with personal names. Like we can go to places and we can go to mythic deities. But where does that bring us? That it's all been, so much of it has been already laid out from the moment of birth. And it's just a matter of, as the Stoics would say, the unraveling of the ball of twine.
And like you say, it's just remarkable. And all the chart examples you use from King Charles to Jackie, and even when I looked in my own life, I was just like, wow, how, again, I just can't explain it. Just the names are there in very
Yeah,
significant
yeah.
places, which is absolutely mind blowing. Do you think in some ways this might tie into, and people have different views on this, and I think I've heard you talk about before about having a past life regression session. I think you were talking about in the 1600s, they were saying you were on the east coast of, or the coast of England somewhere. And
Yeah,
can you maybe tie into that? I'm not explaining it very well.
yeah. At this point in my life, I'm not totally sure about past lives and the ways that especially astrologers are apt to talk about them from different contemporary approaches, or even from many religions. But I do think that when people go into intentional altered states of consciousness, and whatever imagery I had was not total hypnosis, it was just that light trance space where someone counts you down and you walk over a rainbow bridge, but you're still awake and aware. But there's a space where a certain story starts forming in your head that then the facilitator begins to pull out of you. And that might be that we have access to the collective unconscious. And at any particular point in time with the right circumstances, we might be able to open a window into the vastness of that. And that whatever we pull through is meaningful, maybe meaningful, but it's not necessarily a past life. So let me just frame that way. And so I had gone with the intention of why had I lost my memory of the Greek language, which I knew as a child and just haven't been able to reclaim. And the story that then came through was ending up in the 1600s on the west coast of England, Wales, as a young girl who ended up going and learning, whose grandfather was a celestial navigator, and learning the ancient languages in a nearby abbey. And then ending up as an adult in some big city, either copying over manuscripts or translating manuscripts of a quote, occult or esoteric nature. And there was nothing exciting that happened except, I don't know, being married, maybe having a family, and being in a tower turret room piled with papers. Like I said, my reality still is in a little room piled with papers all around me that I'm working on. But anyway, that was the story. And I go, what does that have to do with like forgetting Greek? But okay, your appointment time is over. Go on with your life. And I then went to Boston for an NCGR event. Rob Hand's first Our Hot pamphlet was sitting on my hostess's coffee table about the retrieval of ancient historical texts. I said, that's odd. I could just have this thing. And then I went to Norwalk and they announced Project Hindsight. And then I signed up for it. And then, then all the dominoes started falling one after the other that ended up my children growing up more, going to university, learning Greek and Latin, getting involved with the Hellenistic astrology, teaching the classic Kepler and all of that. And so our question was that fate? I've seen the whole of my life. It's just I used that imagery before of the unraveling of the ball of twine. And it's just like I've been following this thread that keeps unraveling, and I just keep following it, and it brings me to the places it brings me to. And so that was a sequence of events that unfolded from that day forward that turned out to be a pretty big thing before it was done.
Absolutely wonderful. I love that explanation. And going to a different part of the thread, and you've just touched on it there. Yeah. I want to kind of switch gears onto around that time of Project Hindsight. And I believe you were the first subscriber to the project. And maybe
project, and it wasn't intentional. It wasn't like, oh yeah, I want to be first in line. Because at that point, I was like, I've had, I don't know, at least 2 decades of astrology. I'd written 4 books. I was a feminist, asteroid goddess, modern astrologer. But I had this weird session And then they announced the project, and I said, okay, I guess I have some connection. And I turned over my Visa card. And how it happened to be the first one. It was not anything planned. That's how it happened.
Maybe for our younger astrologers or younger
Yeah.
audience, can you explain what Project Hindsight was and the importance of that time for the astrological community?
As astrologers when I started in the 70s and 80s, we all knew we had a long history. The astrologers had been around a long time, and that gave us a certain confidence or pride in what we were doing, that it wasn't like just something that's suddenly a fad. But we didn't really have any idea what that history was, who were its practitioners, what kind of astrology happened, what were the sequence of events. That was simply material that was not in circulation, at least for our community. And that, in fact, the texts of the ancient astrologers hadn't fully been dug out of the basement archives of monasteries and churches until the early 1900s by academics who went on their own project of collating it. And then by the end of the 90s, starting really with James Holden, predating Project Hindsight, but with Project Hindsight making it fully public, was we are going to translate the corpus of astrological texts that were written from, like, let's say, zero, Manilius in the first century, all the way through the Hellenistic era, and then the whole Arabic period with the Latin texts, and even medieval Hebrew texts that Myra Epstein did. And we are going to give astrologers the history that we've all sort of known about abstractly, but we're going to, actually have the material evidence of who the astrologers were and what they wrote and how they thought about this system that was practiced more or less uniformly for 1,500 years before the sun was accepted as the center of the solar system, and astrology fell out of scientific favor during the age of the Enlightenment. And so that was huge for astrologers to finally have access to the beginnings of their foundation, of their tradition.
Absolutely wonderful. Just how difficult was it at that time for, say, modern astrologers who've been through the 60s and the 70s and had a way of doing things to, in some ways, deconstruct what they learned to learn a new foundation or an understanding of traditional astrology? Was there some contention in the community at that time? What was that environment like?
It was awful. And most of the astrologers were really mad. And they were angry, and again, they had their system down pat. It worked for them. They had established businesses. They had clients who liked their readings. And they didn't want to be told that, hey, there was a whole different way astrologers used to do stuff. And there's some very cool things in there if you open your mind to it. And there was a huge resistance. But again, the way it works is not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And that KeplerCollege was one of the key linchpins in facilitating that transition. Because when I returned to the university, was between 1997 and 2000, getting the master's degree in classics. And it was during that time period that KeplerCollege finally got its authorization from the state to award BA degrees. And they were looking for faculty who had to have at least a master's degree in order to be approved by the state. And they knew that I was getting my master's degree, so I would be someone that they could present to get approved. And so halfway through my studies, they said, would you be willing to teach first year history of astrology? And I said, oh yeah, that would be great. And then when I took that back to my professors at the University of Oregon, they were thrilled that one of their graduate students actually got a job based on their classics degree, it looks like. So their attitude was, oh, we've got to get you ready for this. So they helped me create all the teachings for the history of astrology and the ancient medieval period. I then presented at Kepler. And I could write my different papers on different aspects of the history and get the supervision and resources to make them be academically sound. So that was an incredible blessing. So then we go to Kepler. We spent a whole year teaching the history of astrology. At first, the students are shocked, like, hey, we came here to learn how to read charts. What do you mean we have to do this history? And it was like, this is the program, like, get with it or leave. And they loved it. Of course, I was co-teaching with Nick Campion and Robert Hand, and Lee was a part of that first year as well, Lee Lehman. And it was fantastic. And we met in person 4 times a year with all the students. It was one of the highlights of my career, really, of the cooperative team teaching on material that was brand new for the astrological community. And both students and teachers were wildly excited about what was occurring. Then at the end of that year, we held the conference in the same hotel that Norway would be starting as our symposium week ended. So our students could go to Norway. And the Project Hindsight people walked in with a booth. And by that time, Robert Schmidt, after working with the material, it must have been 7 years, was ready to start making his astrological applications. And the people at the booth, Alan White, was a very charismatic, dynamic person involved with the project, did a spontaneous lecture late Friday night. A whole bunch of our Kepler students went to it because they were primed for the ancient stuff, because they had just been studying the ancient stuff for a year. And they were completely enthralled. And they said, we want to learn this. And they came to me, we want to learn this. And I went to intensive that Robert Schmidt was offering the next month in July. And when I heard it, it was like, I don't know, sometimes I say my whole astrological structure, just sort of fell like a sandcastle. And I was totally taken with the rationale and the structure and understanding what all of our predecessors before us had been doing. So I came back to Kepler and I said, we really need to include this in our curriculum. They've learned all about the history. There's also a practice. It only makes sense. And initially it was, well, we don't have any place in our curriculum for it, because when we got our curriculum approved, it didn't even exist. Hellenistic astrology didn't even exist. So we can't go back to the state and start adding stuff. And then at that time, Kathy Coleman was the new president, and Dennis Harness was there for to see what was going on, because he was going to be teaching a class in Vedic astrology that was part of the curriculum, get a sense of what we're doing here. And Dennis said in the meeting, he said, well, I'm fine with opening up my course so we could do a Hellenistic Vedic cross-cultural comparison. And because both he and Kathy had gone to CIIS, the California Institute of Integral Studies, which was an East-West program, It was totally within their framework, interdisciplinary, cross-cultural. And Kathy said, that sounds terrific. And so then it was through that that we introduced the first Hellenistic astrology as a companion piece with Vedic. So each week, Dennis would teach the Vedic approach to planets. I teach the Hellenistic, and we built the course up that way. And then as that course became embedded in the Kepler curriculum, we had a lot of students who became versed in Hellenistic astrology. It was the first course. It was under Robert Schmidt's supervision. And they then went back into the community and started saying, hey, what about this? And hey, what about that? And we got reports sometimes they were really a little bit like bratty at conferences, raising their hands in the audience and challenging established teachers. And so monsters that we created here. But as that began proliferating out again on the student level, the grassroots level, it started to become its own thing, where now many people are aware of the basic fundamentals of traditional astrology. And it's some ways it's sort of trendy to identify yourself as a Hellenistic astrologer.
I have to say, personally,
right, it came.
Personally, I'm very, very grateful, and many of the students, when I graduated through KeplerCollege, coming in at this time after the years of Project Hindsight and the brilliant works of yourself, Chris Brennan, Benjamin Dykes, and the likes, just how fortunate I am and others are to come into astrology this time in the last few years to have access to all of that knowledge is again, our gratitude is well. So you were teaching at KeplerCollege. So do you think in terms of how you were practicing astrology as well at that time, I think what did you say? You had to deconstruct and then rebuild the foundations. And then, but still, I think you've talked about layering still some of the modern concepts and techniques, and of course, still using the asteroids. So I guess that just kind of modified and changed the way you practiced astrology after that.
It did very, very, very much so. And I don't disparage or devalue the contributions of modern psychological astrology, whose aim is like healing the soul and dealing with the real problems and issues that people have. But I also saw how the traditional can lay a foundation. So being able to recognize through the chart where there's a problem and exactly what that problem is, and to assess the severity of that problem using astrological guidelines, can then help focus explaining that to someone and starting the process of working to heal it. It's sort of like in medicine, you can't prescribe the medicine unless you've diagnosed what the problem is with the person. And it's like that piece that the traditional astrology is so good at, because it has clear differentiations between this is good and this is a problem. Whereas in the modern approach that I learned as a modern student is, you never say anything bad. And even if you see something that makes you clench your jaws, oh, no, you can't show any sign of that. And you have to think of the best possible interpretation of that you can come up with. And that's what you give to the client. But the client often comes to an astrologer because they know they have a problem. Right. And if the astrologer is in complete gaslighting and denial and won't go there and tells them, oh, you've got this great potential, and totally inflates the positive potential of something, I think we need to rethink the 100% positive, rosy view that we were taught to present. And of course, that doesn't mean the opposite, that the astrologer sees something in the chart and, I don't want to make light of this, but we did, after a while, you get sort of joking about things that you should not be should be more serious about. You go, so, oh, you're Venus, like that's a D plus bordering on an F. Forget it. But that one can look at a certain planet and go, there are many difficulties here, and you can see why this individual has all of these problems that keep showing up in their lives. And then the traditional helps you delineate the exact what you don't have. Is it in detriment? You don't have the tools, the resources you need to do the job this planet is doing. Is it in fault? You don't get the respect or acknowledgement for your contributions. Is it under the beams of the sun? You're overpowered by someone else who shoves you over and takes whatever little ideas you have and makes it be their own. Is it like maltreated by a heart aspect from Mars or Saturn? There's actual verbal damage that other people are talking bad stuff about you that's unwarranted. Like, what is the nature of the difficulty? And then once you've been able to detail that, okay, now what can we do about it? How can we help you get better resources? How can we help give you the confidence to ask for more respect? But without, and so that's an example of how the Hellenistic, with its clear cut guidelines, clear cut definitions of what's working for you and what's not working for you in your chart. And if you see a planet that's in great condition, go ahead and completely overinflate it and tell the person to go for it 100%. Because from astrology, you have the validation that the planet is in a position to be able to do what it wants to do extremely well. And if they just focus their attention there, it will happen. So,
It's almost the phrase of realistic astrology that we go through life, and of course, there are always ups, but we can have awful times when we lose a job.
yeah,
And you're bringing in, and correct me if I'm wrong, it kind of speaks to this as well. And it's going to be one of my questions, because it seems like one of the major through lines in the transmission or the continuity of astrology through history, from the texts of the Hellenistic to medieval, Renaissance, Indian astrology, is the importance of planetary condition. And I believe you
absolutely.
talked about that falling out of favor, I believe, the turn of the 20th century. And of course, now it's coming back. But as you're saying, you're not to misguide someone, that they come around and they say, right, I really want to start this business. You've got two people,
Yeah.
one really wants to start a business. You look at the condition of the other chart for another person, and it doesn't matter how hard they try, the fortune isn't favoring them
Yeah.
to a certain degree.
Right. So at that point, you look at what is good in the chart. And it's like, and again, as a counselor, you're not going to say, forget it, you're never going to be successful at the business. But you might say something like, hey, have you ever thought about doing that? The things in your chart are really shaped to be successful in that direction. Has that ever occurred to you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely through that. So I love you making that distinction and just bringing, again, back to some realistic astrology where life has ups and downs and it just can't be overwashed with wishful thinking astrology. But
Mhm.
again, not to denigrate the more positive
Right.
ways of look. I think that brings to another question of how successful or really how effective mitigation can be in any sort of way. What's been your experience? Is there any way to mitigate some of the, whether it's essential, debility, accidental, or things that are going on? Is there any ways to mitigate, or how effective is that really?
That question is so much bigger than the question you've asked. And it really goes back to the early years of astrology in the first several centuries, at least, where Hellenistic astrology was formed under the umbrella of the prevailing philosophy of the day, which was Stoicism, that did believe in fate. And the chart could be seen as a person's fate. And, Valens writes, forget about your prayers and sacrifices and entreaties. Like, they're not going to do anything to change the indications of your chart. And to the extent of people being confronted with them, it brings them to a complete state of despair. It doesn't make any difference what I do or don't do. If I have a bad fate, my life is just going to be a total failure. And people can't deal with that. And so the way the human personality nature has dealt with it is to then try to find ways to escape your fate. And one of the reasons that some of the mystery religions and Christianity became so popular at the time that astrology itself was rising in popularity was, if you believed in Jesus, Jesus had the power to override the fate as decreed by the stars, and you would be saved from your fate. Likewise, with some of the other mystery religions that were going on in the Roman Empire. The other thing was the practice of remediation and astral magic. Okay, we can have a transactional relationship with the planetary deities. If you don't like your Venus fate and like you want a husband or a wife, okay, we can do this ritual on a Friday, a Venus day at a Venus hour, and gather together apples and copper and roses and all of the things that Venus likes, and do this remediation, and by golly, we'll get you a partner to be with. Now, it's true that what we call remediation today has its roots in astral magic. In essence, they are means by which to undo the fate that is signified in the chart all on its own, and to, in some ways, validate the power of human agency to counteract the fate. But as astrologers, okay, what are you going to believe? Are you going to believe that the chart at birth is a chart that describes the character of the individual, and its timing describes the events that are going to happen to them over the entire course of their life? You could look at a person's chart when they're 10 and it works. You can look at their chart when they're 70 and it still works. And if it still works at 70, that means that whatever transits and progressions were going to be happening from the beginning of your life at a certain point would still be happening and would result in that. And that's the basis of which you establish the validity of your astrology. Are you going to believe in that? Or if it turns out you don't like that, then are you going to start doing all kinds of things to override it and call it remediation? And can remediation work simultaneously with the integrity of the chart being an accurate description over the course of a person's life? Now, there are many gray areas between those two extremes, but those are the extreme positions that anyone doing remediation needs to address on a philosophical level. You need to understand how it is that you think before you start doing all of this stuff. And the Vedic astrologers, they have addressed it, and that they say, okay, I believe there are 4 different kinds of karma. And some of it is like a group karma. Some of it may be a family karma. Some is individual karma. Some karma you can't change at all. Some you can to a certain extent. And part of their practice is being able to distinguish what isn't possible. And then you're thrown back to the serenity prayer of, God, give me the wisdom to know what I can change and what I can't change and what I have to make peace with, or I didn't say it correctly, but something like that. And so there needs to be an acknowledgement of not only the extent to which remediation is useful, but what is the underlying philosophy, or more correctly, anxiety that makes people want to start remediating. And how does that challenge the fundamental notion of what the astrological chart is in the first place?
I want to switch on to your translation work. Now, I was watching an episode with you, which is I think the gold standard of astrology podcasting, you and Chris. And I think you were telling a story of you, Chris, and Benjamin Dykes. I think
Yeah.
near the ocean somewhere. And I just thought it was very curious. And you were talking about translating texts. And one of my questions is just how difficult is it to look back at those ancient texts to translate? Because I think you even get to a point, you said, where there could be three brilliant astrologers, translators, looking even at a sentence or a word and can come up to different interpretations, which is mind blowing. So, number one, just how difficult is the work of translating, and just how much effort does that require for everyone to come together and work on projects like that?
First of all, Dan and Chris and I didn't get together and translate something together,
Oh,
although we had translations that were done that we questioned. We're trying to understand better and we're questioning the rationale. So, in that process, we brought the original Greek, then brought the Latin, and we looked at certain passages and we retranslated some of those passages and discussed it endlessly what it is we thought was actually being said. And that was, in particular, our focus was a set of aspect definitions that Robert Schmidt had talked about in his most recent book, and that also form the core of like Porphyry and Antiochus and the definitions, and were important in the development of that whole piece of Hellenistic astrology. And that was our focus during that time. So yeah, we had all of our lexicons, we had the critical editions, we had just lots of stuff. And it was like beautiful. It was like a total like exalted Mercury Jupiter week. We were in our element.
so I'm sorry. So it wasn't
So
actually translating; it was just the interpretations that you brought together. So I
the
got.
interpretations and going back and saying, okay, is this what the text said? Can we translate the text in a different way? Did he choose the right word here, or did he translate that phrase? Is there another way that that phrase could be translated that changes the meaning? Okay. And Chris and I, there's one thing in the aspect doctrine that Chris and I still disagree about. And I say it all goes to where the person who made the critical edition decided to put the comma. And like the whole thing depends on the placement of the comma, of which, we've spent probably, dozens of hours talking about.
Absolutely wonderful. Absolutely
Okay.
wonderful. And what is some of the story about? Sorry, go ahead.
But you can have one of the huge shakeups in my mind. When I first started studying Greek and Latin, we had student translations of different ancient texts we had to do for class. And so you have the Greek and you're working along, and then you have an English translation you want to check your work against. And then, well, now you have two or three different translations of, let's say, the same play, and you have the same philosophical piece of Plato. And you have the Greek, and you look at some of these translations and you go, how did they get this whole thing out of these words? And you realize how not only how different translations vary, but what creative license many translators have and how they translate, their choice of words, how much they put in of their own impressions of what they think it meant, what they think it should have said. And we go to the store and we pick up a translation of something and we think, yeah, that's what the original author wrote. And it's absolutely not the case. So that's one of the huge deconstructions involved in the whole thing of translating. And so it's challenging. And there are times now when I'm preparing Hellenistic material and I have the Greek, the critical edition of the Greek, and now I'm even going back into what did the manuscript say that the critical edition was made from, because sometimes you see difficulties there. then you have what Schmidt did, and then you have what Holden said about it. Then you have what Dorian Greenbaum's translated it. And now Levante Laszlo, you see what his translations are. You're looking at 4 different translations. You're looking at the critical edition of the Greek, and you're starting to poke into the manuscripts. And so it's not straightforward. And there's a tremendous areas for interpretation by the translator based on their own biases.
Thank you so much. Now, I actually want to turn on to your incredible 2 volumes in the last couple of years. And of course, it's so thick and so dense, we don't obviously have time to get into all of the specifics, but I'm specifically talking about, of course, the Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice, and the first volume being Assessing Planetary Condition, which we loosely talked about, and volume 2, which came out afterwards, which is delineating planetary meaning. And of course, that so much material to go through, and we don't have time for the specifics, but can you tell us your inspiration by putting just a mammoth task of putting all this together? How long has this taken you? And again, just what inspired you to pull all of this together?
Really, we might go back to the early 80s and the writing of the Astrology for Yourself workbook of how to teach the basics of astrology through a program text approach. That was a format that I continued to use in all the different kinds of things I taught over the years. And then we get up to Project Hindsight, and then we get to KeplerCollege. We have Teaching Hellenistic Astrology at KeplerCollege. And I'm using that same sort of program text kind of format in the KeplerCollege courses. And then for a number of reasons, my teaching came to an end at KeplerCollege in 2006. But I was just like really warming up to ways that I was presenting the teaching of Hellenistic astrology that I didn't want to stop simply because I was no longer teaching there. And so initially, when I thought I was going to create the workbook of Hellenistic astrology, I never imagined it would turn out to be 1,400 pages. But it did. And I got caught up in the dilemma of, in order for this to really make sense, you can't just say, do this and not provide the explanation of why you're doing it. And if I'm writing this book and not putting in all of the rationale that makes it be so compelling in the first place, I'm doing a disservice to the topic and a disservice to the students. And so it's okay, like, well, let's explain it as if I were in class teaching students and really was invested in the students fully understanding and knowing what to do with the material in the chart. And then that's what happened.
And absolutely wonderful. And your teaching skills are absolutely incredible from what students have said, whether that's been at Kepler or other works that you've done through the years. But the mastery of the books is that manual to explain, okay, any particular technique or what's going on, but to apply it at the end as an exercise for the students to go through. So they're not, sometimes you read books and you go from one section to another and you keep going through, but it was after each time, it's like apply it, start to understand it, work with it, and practically use it. Absolutely.
Right. So that, that really, if I, okay, that even goes back like when I was in like college in my 20s. I had one of my work study jobs was tutoring calculus and freshman physics. And I understood that the problems students were having was that the teachers weren't explaining all of the steps in the right order to get to the answer. And they were leaving steps out because they were so advanced. They, oh, well, this is obvious. Everyone like knows like this. And you go, no, if you're confronting it the first time, it's not at all obvious. And if you don't have that step, then you're lost. And of being able to find each progressive piece that you needed to lay in place in the right order. And if you did that, you could get to the end of the proof. You could get to the answer. It could be a seamless flow. And so it's that kind of thinking that I've tried to use in like all of the other stuff, all of the other things that I've taught that creates a positive, successful understanding of the material.
Absolutely wonderful. And your volumes, along with Chris's book, wonderfully complementary and just a treasure for the community. Absolutely.
Yeah. Chris and I, when we knew we both wanted to write, and he was my student, and we've been really close friends for decades now. And so it's okay. We don't want to compete with each other, and let's have our books be complementary. And it's like, Chris, it's fine. You take the history and philosophy. I've already done that. I don't want to have to go over that. I really want to focus on the application. And so there are places where we knew we'd overlap. There are places where we each took a different focus. And we tried as much as we could to be consistent with one another in the use of our terminology and the consistency with the approaches so that students wouldn't get totally confused and mixed up. So a lot of that was intentional on our parts to make them be a pair.
Absolutely wonderful. And not to put you on the spot, and I've heard from others how incredibly draining it is to put together and publish, but any other thoughts of doing anything else in the future, or are you just okay for now?
I'm okay for now.
Okay for now.
I'm okay for now. I think I'm good.
Absolutely. More than enough. Absolutely wonderful. Okay, I've got a couple of a couple more questions because I know how busy you are and I don't want to take too much of your time up. Another question I had for you as well, and I've heard you talk about this before, but particularly for students of astrology, what's the importance of at least learning the basics or the underpinnings of the astronomy, but that underpins the astrology? What are your thoughts on that topic?
It would certainly create better astrologers to go through at least the rigor of learning the astronomical basis of what the chart represents as a flat two-dimensional representation. And that also applies for the math calculations. When I'm reluctant to keep saying, when I learned astrology, it's like, oh, like when I went to school, there were no school buses that walked like 3 miles. But in the 1970s and into the 60s and 70s and all the hundreds of years, thousands of years before that, if you didn't learn the math to do the chart, that was it. You couldn't be an astrologer. You couldn't get any further. And it filtered out certain people from becoming astrologers. And this is why they sometimes put like Mercury and Virgo as being one of the rulers of astrology rather than Uranus and Aquarius, was that it requires a certain rigor of mind which you would then use in the analysis of the chart. And now I'm saying stuff that I regret that I'm saying in public. But I guess I'm in a position where I'm saying it anywhere. Without that rigor, astrology becomes too much like free association. Reading the chart is just free association. Whatever comes to you is what you say. And that doesn't mean that you don't end up saying good, helpful things to the client, but you're not necessarily using one of the skills of astrology, which has to do with a certain rigor of analytical thinking and structure. Both the math and the astronomy help train portions of one's mind so you can use those muscles, so to speak, when you go to analyze the chart.
Wonderful. I think that speaks to the importance of places like KeplerCollege, of course, not an academic institute anymore, but in order for us to graduate like I did, we go through the astronomy and we calculate charts by hand. Now, with the Mercury and Pisces, not in a great place. I'm not particularly mathematically inclined, but it was very useful to see, excuse me, to bring the chart alive. As you're picking out piece by piece and developing it, and it was very, very useful. Many people would argue now it's time consuming, all those kind of things, but I think it still speaks to the importance of knowing how to do that, knowing how to calculate charts by hand and have some basic astronomy under your belt for the astrologer.
Definitely. And like, what is the midheaven? Like, you run a chart off the computer, you have no idea what is the midheaven astronomically, right? If you learn the chart calculations, if you learn the astronomy, at least like you have some idea what that represents on your flat chart.
Absolutely. Whether I see people on social media now and they've got everything on their phones, it's like at least take a walk outside, go in the back door if it's a nice clear sky, have a look, look up, don't be looking down at the phone. Absolutely wonderful. Okay, last couple of questions here. Throughout your career, and again, your incredible body of work over the decades, what accomplishments are you most proud of?
I don't know as if I can answer that question. Instead of like, which one of your children do you love the best?
So would you say it's more the journey and the combination of all of your work?
Really, my response is I feel so grateful that I've been able to have a creative life in astrology, and that it's allowed me to think about all the things I've thought about and to produce them and travel to the places I've been and meeting like amazing people and having fantastic conversations and developing deep friendships and being part of a vibrant community of wonderful people.
Absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And here, more of a philosophical question. Where do you see astrology or the field of astrology heading in the next 50, 100 years, even 20 years from now? Any thoughts or feelings, or just to see how it heads? What are your thoughts?
I don't know how much we can separate that answer from the huge planetary changes that we are in the midst of, that we don't even realize we're like in the midst of the transformation that's happening. And that in 50 years from now, the world is not going to be like the world it is today. And so our projections based on how it is today going forward aren't going to totally be relevant. And I believe Pluto in Aquarius is the transformation into the AI world. And the AI will be probably much better astrologers than we are, based on, not to disparage the human, but based on the rate at which it's learning and getting better that we've seen just in the last year or two, and projecting that forward 50 years. I think Pluto in Aquarius will also challenge what it means to be human, because Aquarius is one of the human signs, because Virgo and the Gemini, the twins, being the others, depictions of humans rather than animals or things. And it's Aquarius, Pluto in Aquarius. Aquarius is a fixed air sign. So it will be, what is the nature of intelligence and how it is that we think, and our whole conceptual framework, as progressively we are giving that over to something that is not human, but that may become more human than we are before it's over.
Do you think as well, with astrology for many decades, for centuries, being on the periphery of society, of course, we have this theological and materialistic scientific intolerance of astrology. Do you think now, as astrology is becoming more popular and tapping into the zeitgeist, do you think that's still going to be the same, that we're still on the periphery as a community, or do you think that might change?
But again, here I have thoughts that are very divergent from popular opinion. I think that astrology traditionally has been a mystery tradition, and it should remain so. And it's really bad for it to be popularized and accepted by the mainstream, because when that happens and people in positions of power then inevitably become aware of what astrology can do, the way that they have misused it has been horrendous, terrible, because it's part of the human nature to abuse power. And so, as long as they think it's superficial and entertainment and superstitious, then that provides a protective veil or covering for the real tradition of astrology to survive and be transmitted. So there have been times when astrology has been more or less popular, and right now it's really popular, but it will go under again. And it's been a wave like that for 4,000 years. So one shouldn't read too much into its current popularity. And the hope that it would be more accepted in the mainstream, I think, is we shouldn't really hope for, unless we're hoping for it so we can collect insurance payments for our readings, or we don't have to be embarrassed when someone asks us what to do.
And last question for today, and thank you so much. What are your future plans? What's happening right now? What's coming up for the future for everybody watching? What's in the works?
I really don't know. I'm having like a 5 pass Pluto opposition to my sun. So I suspect that in another year to 18 months, wherever I am right now won't be where I'll be at that point. I have a couple of events going forward. I'm teaching at the Faye Cochran's Cosmic Convergence Conference in Orlando. I'm doing another asteroid retreat in April. I'll be back to Norwalk, which is like going home for Thanksgiving kind of event. And beyond that, I'm trying not to project too much, because I know I'm in the midst of personal changes, and I know there's going to be political, global, and climate changes as well. So when I try to project forward, I don't get a clear picture. So I'm just allowing the future to reveal itself.
Absolutely wonderful. Well, Demetra, again, it's been an honor and a privilege. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure, Callum, and all good wishes to everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for watching as well, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.